I was living and working in Hong Kong, and one day I found a lump on this side of my neck. And when I went to the doctor and they did a biopsy, they discovered that it was lymphoma, which is a form of lymphatic cancer. I was very, very shocked and surprised. So over a period of 4 years, I developed so much fear of this cancer. And I was following everything. I was researching about it. And I lived my life. I started to live my life just trying to get rid of this cancer that was in my body. But I kept getting worse and weaker and weaker. And at that point, the doctors said that it's too late, even for anything. Your body is already too far gone. You're already dying. You only have about 3 months to live. I kept wishing that this was a bad dream. My body was not absorbing any nutrition. I weighed 85 pounds. I looked like a skeleton. My lungs were filled with fluid. The tumors now in my body were all over my lymphatic system. They were the size of golf balls. And by February the 1st, 2006, I went into a coma. The nurse gave me a big dose of morphine because I hadn't been able to sleep or anything for many days because of the fluid in my lungs. And I was in so much pain and so much discomfort. And then on February the 2nd, in the morning, I didn't wake up. So it was at that point that the doctors told my family that these were my final hours and that my organs were now shutting down and I was going through the dying process. But what everybody around me didn't know was that I had left my body and I felt amazing. I could see and feel and hear everything that was happening all around me. But I felt light and free, and all the pain was gone and all the fear was gone. Something that I call unconditional love, I'd never felt anything like that in my physical life before. And I was aware of my body lying there in that hospital bed. But my body looked so small and helpless and lifeless compared to how I was feeling now. And I wanted my family to know that I'm fine. In fact, I'm better than fine. I feel fantastic. But there was no way for me to communicate with them. I was able to see and hear everything the doctors were doing, like they were taking fluid out of my lungs. And it was very different from having physical eyes. It was more like I had 360-degree peripheral vision. I could be aware of things that were happening behind, on the sides, above, below, everywhere, and beyond the walls. I was seeing and hearing conversations take place beyond the hospital room. And my husband was talking to the doctor outside, about 40 feet away, outside the room that I was in, and I was able to see and hear everything. I could even see and be aware that my brother, who was living in a different country, he was living in India at the time, I was able to see that he was rushing to get on a plane to come and reach me because he wanted to get to me before I died. I remember even feeling, gosh, I better not die until he gets here.
Like many of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s, like I did, I knew science is the pathway to truth. And as much as I wanted to believe a lot of what I'd heard in my Methodist church growing up about an afterlife, about God, power of prayer, my work in science, and especially as I pursued a career in neurosurgery, left me wondering how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. So I taught for about 15 years at Harvard Medical School. That was all setting the stage for my near-death experience. So it's important to point out we never, ever understood why this happened. When I first got to the emergency room, the doctors were very alarmed because of how quickly I'd gone downhill. Over 3.5 hours, I was deep in coma, grand mal seizures, and they found out the next day from microbiology that it was gram-negative bacterial meningitis caused by E. coli. And then, of course, they put me on 3 powerful intravenous antibiotics on a ventilator, and I went through that week not really showing any signs of improvement. So by the end of the week, the doctors held a family meeting on day 7 of coma. It was a Sunday morning when they said it was, I was gone from a 10% chance of survival down to 2% chance. But unfortunately, they thought if I was in that 2% survivor category, that would never translate into any meaningful recovery. So that's why they suggested stopping the antibiotics and just letting nature take its course. Let the infection run, let me go. So way too deep in coma to have had any experience, especially when you realize that the CT and MRI show extensive damage. And yet the exact opposite is what I experienced. So how that journey unfolded was, beginning in that earthworm eye view, I was rescued by a slowly spinning white light. Initially, that portal led up into what I call the Gateway Valley. It was far more real than this world. It makes this world look like a dream. That's one thing that people have trouble understanding, because they think this is hardcore reality. Well, that world is far more real than this one. It was so refreshing and reassuring, I cannot put it into words. And it was soon after that I had this sensation of a soft summer breeze blowing through that was like my first awareness of the divine presence of that infinitely loving force that so many other near-death experiencers from all continents, all cultures, all belief systems, all millennia in the last 5,000 years have talked about this same kind of realm. And that's where our religions come from and all that.
To me, it felt very, very real. In fact, it felt more real than this physical reality. It was as if my awareness was expanding more and more, like going through different levels, because after a while, I started to leave this physical level. And when we leave our physical body, we leave behind everything that's associated with our body, our biology, our voice, our race, our religion. All of that gets left behind. And what crosses over is just pure essence, pure spirit, or pure love. We can call it whatever we want. And so I started to encounter the essence or the spirit of other people who were familiar to me, like my dad, who had died 10 years ago. I felt his presence around me. And even though he wasn't in his physical body, I recognized him immediately. It was literally like his energy and my energy just merged. And I was like, oh, Dad, it's you. I just knew. And we're not even talking to each other. We don't need to explain who we are. We know what each other is feeling right away without words. My dad and I, when I was growing up, we had a very turbulent relationship because I rebelled against my culture. I come from a culture where women are considered second-class citizens. And so my dad and I clashed a lot, and I even ran away from an arranged marriage. So when he passed away, I had always thought that I had let him down, that I had disappointed him as a daughter. But now here he was on the other side with me, and all I felt from him was pure, unconditional love. And I felt he understood why I was the way I was. So it was just the most incredible feeling. I then felt that I was surrounded by other beings, and I didn't recognize them all from this life, but I did feel that I was just unconditionally loved by them and that they were there to protect me and help me. And I started to understand that I've always been protected, but not just me, we all are, but we don't realize it. We don't know this.
I was surprised by the incredible power of love that I felt by thousands of beings around me going off into the mist with their heads down, murmuring, many praying. I remember the angelic choirs above that were fueling all this beautiful dancing and merriment served as yet another portal to higher and higher levels, all the way out to what I call the core. Infinite inky blackness, but filled to overflowing with unconditional love of that divine source. And I would cycle through those levels. I would tumble back down to that earthworm eye view, but I could navigate back up by remembering the sounds. The music provided portals to traverse those realms. And I'd been told every time I entered the Corps, you are not here to stay. You'll be going back, but we'll teach you many things.
And then a lot happened on that side, but I reached a point where I felt that I had a choice as to whether to come back into my body or to stay on the other side. No part of me wanted to come back because my body was sick and dying. I was suffering here. My family were suffering, taking care of me. But it was like I entered this state of clarity where I then understood why I had been sick. I understood how it was that so many of the thoughts and the decisions and the choices I had made in my life had led me to that point where I was lying there on that hospital bed. And I realized that I had lived this life of fear instead of a life of passion and joy and love. I had never allowed my soul, my spirit, to express itself and be all that it had come here to be, and that I was more powerful than I had ever known or believed. So in this state of clarity, I received the message that now that you know the truth of who you really are, go back. If you choose to go back into your body will heal. And it was at this point that I felt my dad was telling me, you need to go back. It's not your time yet. And so it was at that point that I made the choice to come back. I started to understand that I had a bigger purpose to fulfill, something much bigger. And I didn't know what it was. I had no idea what it was. But it was like I had the understanding that all I have to do is be myself and live my life fearlessly, and my purpose would unfold before me. And it was at that point that I started to come out of the coma. My family and everybody around me were really shocked, but they were so happy that my eyes were opening up. It was like I had one foot on each side. I kept saying to them, Dad is here. Dad's telling me that it's not my time. I'm going to be fine. And I was just saying this over and over, and they were wondering what's going on. The doctor basically told my family, don't raise your hopes because she's still critical. Sometimes it happens. And then the doctor said, these are the drugs just messing with her mind. She's hallucinating. But then I said to the doctor, aren't you the doctor that took the fluid out of my lungs at about 4 a.m. this morning? And that's when he said, but you were in a coma. You couldn't know that. So he got really shocked and started to wonder what's going on. I said to my husband, isn't he the doctor that said, I'm not even going to make it through the night? And my husband said, you couldn't possibly have heard that. He said that to me outside of the room, down the hallway near the nurses' station. And then what started to happen is over the next few days, the tumors just continued to shrink and the doctors just could not understand it. I had to start getting a little bit stronger and start getting out of bed. And within 3.5 weeks, they could find no trace of the cancer anymore. And within 5 weeks, they let me go home to live my life cancer-free. And that was 14.5 years ago.
And then I came back to this world. But when I did, when I woke up in that ICU bed on day 7 of coma, all I knew was where I had been. My brain was so wrecked, and I still had no memories of my life before. So when I was first coming out of coma and they first extubated me, I was still not even recognizing loved ones at the bedside, although that recognition in my language came back very rapidly, literally over hours. Memories were even more complete than they had been before coma. That was something that was a real shock. Everything turned around tremendously. I mean, inexplicably. And that's one of the points that's made in that case report about my medical records, is how this is not just like, oh, well, we see this, 1% of the time, or we just don't see it.
So the medical people's opinions was very, very mixed. One thing that they all agreed on is that I am lucky to be alive. They all agreed that I should have died. Another one of my doctors says that all the things that I experienced, what I say happened on the other side, seeing my dad and everything, he says that was my brain hallucinating. And he says that was the drugs messing with my mind. But that's the other part that the doctors and the medical people could not explain, is how was I able to see my brother? How did I know he was on a plane flying to see me? And how did I hear the doctors? But my doctor who was treating me actually said that you're not the first person to tell me such a story. And he said he has heard other patients who have experienced crossing over on the other side. And what happened, though, is that I was interviewed once by a local newspaper. And then the newspaper journalist said to me, would your doctor be willing to verify everything that happened? And I said, yes, he completely believed me. But when the newspaper interviewed him, he didn't say everything the way he said it to me. And he was too embarrassed to speak it publicly. And many years later is when another doctor said to me that, yeah, if we say these things publicly, we can be ridiculed and we can even lose our license.
True open-minded skepticism is absolutely important ingredient in this quest. I will say I was my own worst skeptic. I'd spent 54 years of my life honing a very conventional scientific worldview. But essentially, my coma journey to a neurosurgeon interested in explaining consciousness had a tremendous number of lessons to help me understand that much of what we thought was completely wrong. And what I've found is in the 11 years since, I've worked with many scientists around the world who are interested in consciousness. All of the tremendous evidence that is available to all of us who study things like the afterlife, parapsychology, the reality of things like telepathy, remote viewing, out-of-body experiences. All these phenomena of consciousness, bringing science and spirituality together and explaining consciousness in a much more satisfactory fashion than the very bleak and paltry fiction of materialist explanation. So obviously, you have to study these phenomena directly.
My name is Dean Radin. I'm the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Petaluma, California. If you don't know what ions is, then you should not be watching this movie because it's too late, basically. The Institute of Noetic Sciences is an institute devoted to studying the nature of consciousness. It's part of a spectrum of experiences. So some of them are psychic, some are mystical, some are déjà vus, clairvoyance, precognition, the whole range of experiences that are actually very common in terms not of belief, but of what people actually experience. These kinds of things happen. The next question is, well, why don't we find departments of psychic research in every university? The answer is that in the modern world, we follow a certain set of assumptions about the way that reality is. And so a philosopher would call it materialism. And it's the idea that everything that we know, including the mind, is made up out of matter and energy. From that perspective, the idea that aspects of your mind or awareness can transcend space and time, because that's the strangeness of mystical and psychic experience, these things are considered impossible. It's not possible to have parts of your awareness extending away from your brain. So because the prevailing idea is that it's impossible, the only way of understanding the experiences is that they're either made up, or they're coincidence, or some other mundane explanation.
One of the problems with materialist science is they keep looking in the material world to try and prove things. So if you're looking at the physical brain and you're saying, well, we assume that this thing creates consciousness, and then you see all these things you can measure, like on a functional MRI or on magnetoencephalography or a spectral electroencephalogram or whatever your mode of examining the brain, if you're sitting there thinking whatever we see is going to explain it all, you're obviously misled. Sorry, it's not there.
I think it's important to be clear that the brain and the mind, or the brain and internal experience, are clearly correlated with each other. So there's a relationship between brain activity and our internal experience. But that relationship actually doesn't say very much about what is the causal direction. The usual presumption is that the brain processing is the causal reason why we have consciousness. But that's an inference that would be very difficult to justify, because it could just as well be in the other direction. And in fact, this is what gives rise to ideas that it's not that the brain is generating consciousness, but rather the brain is receiving consciousness or as a filter of consciousness which is somehow out there. This is the difference between looking at a radio and listening to it playing music and opening up the radio expecting to find little tiny people with instruments in it. Well, that's not what happens. You open the radio and you see something which ultimately is receiving information that's coming from somewhere else.
From the time I was a child, I was intrigued by the physical world and by what is the mind. So I went on and got my PhD in neuroscience and then began doing research in rehabilitation neuroscience. So things like working with children with cerebral palsy, people with stroke, people with Parkinson's disease, and trying to find new therapies to help them move better, to make their brains function better again. So I enjoy that, but I should say that at a certain point in my career, I had an experience in meditation at a meditation retreat that shifted my whole understanding of awareness. I was a bit in a quandary because I had a sense that there was more to consciousness than I had originally thought. And everybody on this world would say the brain is very important in our embodied consciousness. We all know that. But at the same time, when you look at other research, for example, on near-death experiences, you find out somebody has had cardiac arrest, their brain has completely stopped, and yet these people nevertheless retain their consciousness, and they do something even more than that. They actually see now everything around them from a perspective outside of their body. The point is that if there is no brain activity in the entire cortex, there couldn't even be a hallucination. And that's what the materialist neuroscientists have to deal with. And of course, one of the things they'll say is, well, maybe the experience happened when there was still a little bit of brain activity and they just thought it was happening in the middle of the coma. But in fact, you can prove by what they were seeing that they were definitely in the middle of a deep, deep coma with no brain activity, watching things happening then. And they are seeing non-local events that would be impossible even to see with the normal brain.
You've been studying the wrong thing. The brain doesn't produce consciousness, but is simply that a transceiver or a filter. A filter is a beautiful word for it, and that's not a new theory. That actually came more than 100 years ago from the likes of William James, who was a renowned Harvard psychologist. F.C.S. Schiller was another proponent of filter theory, as was Aldous Huxley, who wrote Doors of Perception. He came to realize that consciousness was far more profound than just something produced by a brain locally.
So right now, the brain filters everything out but the five senses, and therefore I see you and the things around me as almost like a measly trickle, someone said, of what is actually available for me to see. And the idea that William James brought forth was that when you have a mystical experience or a near-death experience, what happens is those filters in the brain are actually partially removed. But in normal waking physical consciousness, those filters are there for a good reason, to help us function in this physical world.
Yeah, clearly what we perceive with our ordinary senses in the everyday world is not the world. It's a cartoon of the world. We're picking up portions of the electromagnetic spectrum, which is very thin, goes from DC, or 0 hertz, up to basically infinity. We're picking up a thin slice. This is true for every one of our senses. So we're picking up little tiny pieces of an energetic world out there, and from that constructing the world that we see. So our sense of what is out there, our common sense view, is a construction. We know that. That's easy to demonstrate. Then, of course, it begs the question, well, what is the real world? What is it really like? There it gets much more difficult to talk about. One would think, perhaps, that under certain degrees of meditative experience, under transformative experiences that could be spontaneous, what is often reported is typically by mystics, that they now experience the world the way it actually is.
One thing that happens with many people who have a near-death experience is that when they come back, they now have psychic abilities that they don't even necessarily want. And sometimes these psychic abilities frighten them.
What we study are experiences, ultimately. People have strange experiences. So they would include things like precognitive dreams and presentiments of things about to unfold, telepathic experiences, mind-matter interaction effects, those kinds of things. The challenge from a scientific perspective is how do you then take those experiences, bring it into the laboratory so you can study it under controlled conditions where you can tell the difference between a coincidence and a real effect. So for precognition, many different types of experiments all suggest that we do have the capacity to know what's about to unfold, even under conditions where we can't infer it. We also have many experiments showing that through clairvoyance, that we can perceive, not always visually, but we can perceive something that is happening at a distance. So that means that both through space and through time, we somehow can do that. We have the perception ability to do that. Another whole class of studies is the nature of whether consciousness survives bodily death. So is consciousness part of the body or not? It clearly interacts in some way, but maybe it doesn't need the body. So these are survival-based studies where we look at things like mediumship and near-death experiences and those kinds of phenomena, some of which can be brought into the laboratory, and we can verify whether or not, for example, a medium who claims to be talking to a dead person and getting information from that dead person, is the information correct under conditions where they can't fake it, or they can't get the information in other ways. And there too, we can verify that that actually does happen sometimes. We're maybe capable of much more than we currently think. From a scientific perspective, these things shouldn't happen, but they do happen. So clearly, we've missed something important. So I want to find out what it is. What does it mean?
I'm Rupert Sheldrake. I'm a biologist. I did research at Cambridge on the development of plants. I taught at Cambridge. I was a fellow of Clare College. I studied philosophy at Harvard. I did history and philosophy of science there. The reason I did that was because when I was a student in Cambridge, I felt that biology had become very limited by this mechanistic theory of life, treating animals and plants as machines and treating people as machines. And I wanted to see if it's possible to have a philosophy of science, a way of doing science that was more broad and more inclusive. Since then, I've been doing research in morphic resonance, memory in nature, and on unexplained abilities of animals and people. There's a lot of evidence for these phenomena. I mean, from years of research by psychic researchers and parapsychologists. But from the materialist point of view, all my mental activity is in my head. So if I think about you and you're 100 kilometers away and I want to telephone you and you start thinking about me, and when I ring you, you say, "That's funny, I was just thinking about you," a very common kind of telepathy. Almost everyone has experienced this, and I've shown by means of controlled, randomized experiments that this is not just chance coincidence. But from a materialist point of view, that's impossible. My thoughts cannot possibly influence you 100 kilometers away. Phenomenon like telepathy is impossible. Therefore, all the evidence for it, the fact that most people say they've experienced it, it just proves these are stupid people who've not been educated enough. And if there's evidence for it from scientific experiments, like my experiments, or those of Dean Radin or many other scientists, then those experiments must be flawed. There must be some error in the experiments. This debate has been going, it's not really a debate, because it's a denial campaign has been going on for decades and enormously influences the educational systems. Most people are interested in these phenomena because they actually happen and they influence their lives. But then when they see a culture of denial in the scientific world, what this does is makes people feel that science is dogmatic, narrow, and limited, and they're right.
It's really unfortunate the way science is practiced today. It's kind of like an old boys club where about the only way to get things done is to do experiments that prove the accepted hypotheses about the universe. And yet when you hit all these jagged edges that say the model is wrong, what our current community tries to have us do is, well, no, stick to the plan. But if you sooner or later get to a point, as Thomas Kuhn pointed out in his book about scientific revolutions back in the mid-20th century, where you have a breaking point, where there's so much evidence that breaks the rules of the reigning paradigm that you have to basically throw the paradigm out.
So at this time, there are approximately 10 different meta-analyses of classes of experiments looking at various kinds of psychic phenomena, published in mainstream journals. So why does it remain controversial? They will say that the reason why these studies look like they're significant is because of questionable research practices, the dreaded QRPs. So the QRPs include things like selective reporting. So you're only publishing the positive results and you're not publishing the negative results, which will create a big bias when you do the analysis. So what they're looking for generally is one of two things. So they're looking for an application which is undeniable, typically involved in some way like making a lot of money. If you're so smart, go to Las Vegas and make a lot of money. So that's one approach. The other one that changes people's minds is a single personal experience. The whole point of a taboo is a social agreement about what you can talk about and what you shouldn't talk about. The irony is that despite a huge amount of scientific evidence showing that these experiences are what they seem to be, they're real, the taboo persists in the academic world especially, not so much outside of academia, but within mainstream academia, you simply are not allowed to talk about this stuff.
When you step out of a worldview like this, you know what will happen in terms of what your colleagues will think about you. They will say, oh my goodness, this person has now gone weak-minded and they are not really a credible scientist anymore. And it's very, very true that many young scientists who do not have tenure at universities yet, who have started to do research on meditation, have not received tenure from their colleagues because the colleagues decided that they were really not academically credible like they originally thought they were. So you know you have a high probability of losing your career.
So one of the complaints I get from my more mainstream colleagues is that if psychic phenomena were really true, it would upset everything that we know and have to throw away all of our books and start over again. To which I replied, that is actually not the case. That what we know about physics is very likely to remain exactly the same, because the physical world is very stable. What we know about biology and chemistry and all the rest of it is going to remain the same.
We don't throw away the science we've got. What the science we've got has done is established a whole range of facts about nature, and it's extremely successful in building machines. It's very unsuccessful in understanding consciousness, in understanding the interconnectedness of nature, and in understanding our role in the world and in nature. That's why we have an ecological crisis. There's something gone horribly wrong by applying this kind of science, which is very limited, without a bigger picture.
Science is one way of understanding the world. It gives a pretty good picture for a lot of things, but it doesn't do very well in understanding the nature of consciousness. In order to then understand psychic phenomena, we probably need to revise or re-look at some of the assumptions underlying the way that science is developed. And so one of the ways of doing that is to question the assumption that everything starts with physics. Maybe there's something more fundamental than the physical world. And so what do we know that doesn't seem to be physical and yet quite real? It's our internal experience. It doesn't seem to have physical qualities to it, but we can't deny that we have experience. So maybe that's more fundamental. If that's the case, then if you think of the scientific disciplines as a hierarchy with physics at the bottom and then chemistry, biology, psychology, maybe there's something that needs to go below physics. So a number of thought leaders today across the board in science are beginning to say things like, what's more fundamental than matter and energy is information. It's somewhat more abstract than what we think of as physicality, but from information you can create matter and energy. You can describe it and form a universe based on information. Well, all of that is closely aligned with the esoteric traditions, which say ultimately that consciousness is more fundamental in the physical world. It all comes from consciousness somehow. Whether it's Kabbalah or Neoplatonism or Hermeticism or you name it, you find it in almost every esoteric tradition, a way of thinking about how consciousness in its primordial state turns into reality.
That's idealism. That's the notion that only the mental exists, and that in fact the universe is mental primarily, and that all the physical universe simply emerges based on the principles of that mental realm. Top-down causality. When you combine the consilience of the neuroscience of consciousness, philosophy of mind, of quantum physics, which is the most fundamental presentation of the mind-body question, and they're all converging to say, consciousness is the one thing that exists, that all of physical reality emerges out of that. it just becomes obvious that this is a mental universe. Mind has tremendous power over matter, and we prove that all the time as humans with our own health.
My basic education in the university was understanding the nature of cell biology, how cells work. So I was a stem cell research scientist at University of Wisconsin School of Medicine, where I was a professor, and at Stanford University later, where I was a research scientist expanding the knowledge of epigenetics. To understand the nature, what is the difference between genetics and epigenetics? When I say this character, this disease is under genetic control, that is the belief that genes turn on and off and made the disease. This makes us a victim because, as far as we know, we didn't pick the genes, and here the genes turn on and off by themselves. Then you realize, I'm just like a time bomb. And one day the gene goes boom, and then I get cancer. I'm a victim. But the new science, epigenetics, which means control above the genes, which turns out to be environment, but our perception of the environment, is what controls the genes. I say, well, if perception and environment control genes, we as individuals, we can control our environment, and we can control our perceptions. Consciousness, lifestyle, belief systems, these are the ultimate controls of the gene. So the relevance is important, is because, as we know, that if you got a cancer gene and that's what you believe, then you think I'm going to get the cancer, and then you get a cancer and you say the genes did it, and now we know, no, that there is no cancer gene. There is not one gene that causes cancer. Genes are correlated with cancer, meaning if your life is not in harmony and you have one of these genes, you can activate a cancer. But the point is, having the gene does not cause the cancer. 50% of the women that have the same BRCA1 gene never get the cancer. The point is very important. So we have to help people take them from the belief I'm a victim and give them the science that no, your consciousness is creating this life experience in here. Your consciousness is controlling your genes. And so my evolution took me from the genes to the role of the mind, and that the mind is the absolute control of our biology. And when we give our power to other people, their beliefs control our biology. If I buy their story, and it's not a good story, then I've just altered my life. And this is why we need to take the power back. And people say, oh, that positive thinking doesn't really work, but that's not true. The best example of positive thinking in a scientific study is called placebo. You have a disease and the doctor says, here's this new pill and it's the brand new science and it's going to cure you, and you believe it. And you take the pill and you get well. Then you find out the pill was a sugar pill. So then you're left with, so what made me well? It's not the sugar pill. It was the positive belief in that sugar pill and how it's going to help your life.
Sometimes mechanistic doctors try to dismiss all alternative healing by saying it's nothing but the placebo effect. But the fact is the placebo effect works. And in fact, regular medicine depends on placebo effects as well. Does it really matter what we call it? The fact is it's happening. And it shows that the belief and the expectation are actually influencing the healing process.
But people don't recognize negative thinking is equally powerful, but it works in the opposite direction. The American Psychological Association has recognized 90% of doctor visits are due to stress. And it turns out that stress is the major cause of problems in health. And that stress is a consciousness issue. So if you can control stress, then you can control your health. And that's what the new science is all about.
So the mind-body connection is now recognized as a thing. The next stage are things like affirmations. Affirmations, in terms of the literature of affirmations, rivals the number of books sold for religious texts. It's extremely popular. It's been around a long time in many different versions. There's some people who will say, well, if you want a gold-plated Mercedes, you just think about it really hard, and there it is. And now you have a gold-plated Mercedes. That's yours somehow. So, of course, nothing works that simply. But because of the association between the idea of you create your own reality and suddenly manifesting mounds of gold out of nothing, then people, of course, would be very reluctant to say, well, I believe in that because it sounds crazy. In fact, as stated, it is crazy. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean that affirmations don't work, that they don't manipulate the world in some way. So I personally believe, based on the experimental work that I've done, that we do create our own reality on many layers. So even among my colleagues, what I just said is probably considered controversial, because I'm more liberal-minded than some of my more conservative colleagues. But based on the experiments that I've done, the way that I interpret it, I think that we actually do, to a small extent, manipulate the world in a literal way and not simply in a psychological way.
If you look back at various spiritual traditions, even from way back in India, intention was considered very, very important. And in fact, the term in Sanskrit is sankalpa. It means that when you have a strong intention, that you can literally move ahead much, much more quickly than you can if you don't have an intention with whatever you want to do. And people might say, well, that doesn't always happen to me, but what we often notice with an intention is that there's the surface of our intellect that says, for example, I want to lose weight. But underneath, there's a stronger, what I would call my alligator brain or my unconscious desire to eat wonderful, rich foods, and they often compete with each other. And so you think your intention is to lose weight, but you may have a stronger intention for something else, or your intention may be distracted. Then we might look at our distractions or the things that might keep that intention from happening, like maybe a fear of actually being successful in the world that some people may have.
We have to understand during development, the brain is the equivalent of a computer. And the beginning part is it's got an operating system, so now the brain is going to work, but it doesn't have any programs. So nature creates the first 7 years of a child's life to download programs. A child below 7 has a vibration of the brain that's less than conscious. It's called theta. You can't give an infant a book and say, study the rules of how to be a member of a family. Study the rules of how to be a member of a community. Thousands of rules. So how does a child get a chance to learn? He's not even able to read. And the answer is, it doesn't have to. Because the brain is in theta, which is hypnosis. It watches the community, and whatever it sees is downloaded just like a video recorder. Watch my mother, watch my father. See how they did it? I record that. Now I have a program. So for the first 7 years, we download behavior, but from other people. And the problem is this, most of their program behavior is not very positive. So we're actually downloading programs that are not helping us. And this goes into the subconscious. So the subconscious is like a hard drive in a computer. It's got programs, okay? And the conscious mind is the creator, like the one that types on the keyboard. But you still have to work through the program. So here's the interesting conclusion. 95% of our life is coming from the program. Your life is a printout of your program. Conscious mind is wishes and desires. That's what you want from your life. Health, happiness, good relationship, good job. Conscious mind, creative. But when conscious mind is thinking 95% of the day, the automatic behavior is coming from the program.
Very often, we don't realize the concepts that we're holding inside of us about either I can't do that or this is impossible or things like that. And I think that's an interesting word that we use often, psychologists use it as well, that we project onto the world what our story, which is our own filter, our own lens, is telling us about it.
We have in our head very positive thoughts, but our life doesn't match the thoughts. If the life isn't working well, if we say you're a victim, that means I'm powerless. Oh, it happened to me, I'm just a victim. I go, there are no victims. We are creating what we are doing. So all you have to do is look at your life, and first thing is this, you say, the things that I like that come into my life, they come into my life because I have a program to let them come in. More important, the things that you want, but you struggle over, you have to work hard for it, you have to sweat to make it happen. Why are you working so hard? The answer is inevitably whatever you want and you can't get it is because the program you have doesn't support it. And so, of course, the most important thing is, can I change the program? You have to remember, this is the habit mind. Habits do not want to change. If a habit changes, then it's not a habit anymore. So thank God you learned how to walk before you were 2. It doesn't change, and you're still walking. You could be 100. Okay, but that creates an issue then. What if my programs I don't want and I want to change them? I go, oh, well, it learns in a different way than the conscious mind. This is why people read a self-help book, and if you give them a test, they can get 100. I understood everything in the book. I say, did your life change? No, but I understand everything in the book. And I go, that's because conscious mind downloaded that information. But conscious mind only working 5% of the time means I don't care what you read in the book, your subconscious is still controlling it. But now we want to change subconscious. I go, but that has to have a special learning process. So there are 3 ways to change beliefs. Number 1, self-hypnosis, earphones at night. Number 2, create a new habit and practice it, just practicing, repeating it. And number 3, energy psychology is a way of changing programs very quickly. And this is what we all need now because the planet is in a very tough situation right now, and we all have to change our beliefs because our beliefs are creating a problem.
Unfortunately, we do not come into the world with a user's manual. It would be very convenient if we did have a user's manual with an index where we could look up things like, well, why am I here? Do I have a purpose? All of those kinds of questions, but we don't have that. The closest that we have to it are traditional religions, because they will be very happy to tell you exactly why you're here and what you should do and all the rest of it. But for somebody who doesn't follow traditional religions, it still doesn't take away this internal sense that we have that we want to know. Is there meaning to anything? If people experience tragedies in their life of any sort, they immediately come face to face with this notion of, do I live in a completely purposeless universe, or is there some meaning to any of this? But it's a question that everyone faces at one time or another. Ultimately, what you really learn is what you learn from the inside.
My dad was an artist. He taught me to observe. We lived in the deep country. I was used to being alone. It was natural to look at the weather, look at the sky, and Dad was very good. Yes, he was always noticing which way the wind was blowing, and he'd notice the way, what was happening to the leaves, how they were growing. And we had compulsory chapel. We'd have to go to chapel twice a day and say our prayers morning and evening beside our bed. So I very soon began to find a safety in what I might call prayer. I went to a school of meditation in London, and I stayed with them for 20 years. I used to go down. I was given a mantra. You're given a sound, which seems like a meaningless sound, and you just repeat this sound. This is how meditation works. You never try to get rid of thoughts. You can't do that. But you put in an alternative, like this meaningless mantra, and you just repeat that sound. Even if you just say it half a dozen times, for those few seconds, your attention is not on your thoughts, it's on this mantra. You know, the more you give attention to something, the bigger it gets, doesn't it? It magnifies. The more you think about your problem, the bigger it gets. But if you think about something else, what happens? It gets less. Because the attention is really the life force that gives things life. So if you turn your attention to something else, your thinking is diminished. This is how meditation works. And I've had a long life. I've been a farmer. I've been many things. I've traveled widely. I've done all sorts of things. But this meditation I've practiced morning and evening. I've hardly missed for all these years, and I still do it now. And I really consider this to be my work.
Thinking, the little voice in the head. I love the way Michael Singer puts it in his book, The Untethered Soul. He calls that running stream of thoughts in the head, the monkey mind that we all have, you know, this chatterbox of thoughts, inner dialogue. He calls that the annoying roommate. And so many people identify with that. They think they are their thoughts, their memories of what they've been through in their life, and they identify completely with that. And that can be a terrible trap. That little voice in our head, that's not who we are. That's not the deep and profound kind of higher consciousness we are. But we can come to identify very richly with that by going within. For example, many scientists, philosophers, artists, musicians, etc., have found ways to get into that kind of universal mind by quieting the voice in the head and actually opening themselves to full-blown creativity. Getting in that hypnagogic space. It's a rich source of creativity, of understanding, of insight, of guidance. As a sentient being, we all have the power to meditate, to go within consciousness and explore and find out much more about who we are and what our relationship with the universe is.
So let's assume that there is a parallel between our understanding of the physical world and our understanding of consciousness itself. The conscious world, the conscious mind are very tightly coupled. The classical physics, in a sense, is like a refinement of common sense. It is the world as we see it. It's real. Our awareness is real as well. But just below that, we start saying, oh, the world is a little bit more complicated. Quantum physics, nuclear physics. You also find in meditation, the world there is a little more complicated too, because now you're more in contact with your subconscious. You go down, 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 down until you're at the bottom. We don't know what the bottom is, but let's assume it's way down there somewhere, both in the physical sense and in the mental sense. So in the magical traditions, this is the way that magic is described as working. That you go down into the state that a magician will call gnosis, or a yogi will call samadhi, which is a deep level of awareness, where you're still able to operate. That is then not simply parallel to the physical world, but it converges with it. It is the physical world at these deep levels. So if I'm at this very deep level of reality where mental and physical are not that separate from each other, and I put a little intentional spin that I want something, that could manifest into the physical world as the something that I wanted. What I've just described is basically the idea within the yogic tradition, where the siddhis, the special powers that arise as a result of meditation, a very tiny thought or intention at a deep mental state could manifest as a monstrous effect in the physical world. The caution that happens within the magical traditions is to avoid black magic. Black magic is overriding somebody else's free will. And this is why in parables and stories you constantly read about the equivalent of Darth Vader. You have someone with a little bit of talent, they start using it, they were originally doing only white magic, but they get seduced by the power and they become Darth Vader. It's how we decide to use that power, which is starting to spin out the ethical considerations of it.
So each and every one of us is more than just a physical body. I discovered there is so much more to our reality than we have ever been led to believe. But we have not been taught to tap into it. And the intuition is really your connection to your higher self or your soul or your spirit or source or whatever we want to call it. And the mind is what decides how much of the spirit or soul is allowed to come through. And to me, this is what it means to have an open mind versus a closed mind. People who have a more closed mind struggle more because they allow less of their intuition or their spirit to come through and express itself through their physical body. So the mind literally acts like a filter. You have the choice as to how much you want to open that mind up. And when you allow your intuition will always guide you to what is best for you. What does it make me feel? Does it make me feel expanded or small? And that is one thing that they don't teach you at schools or college. Nobody asks you, how does it make you feel, including what career you choose.
One of the consequences of a materialistic understanding of the brain-mind relationship is that it leads to the idea that your sense of awareness, your consciousness, is a side effect of the brain processing. Then that leads to the notion of a nihilistic universe. It's a universe that doesn't have any meaning or purpose. That, in a sense, is the way that modern civilization works. That the best that you can do in a nihilistic universe is to die with the most toys. That's the way it's sometimes put. And among other things, the notion that your life really doesn't have any meaning to it and that you're completely isolated from other people, which is another consequence of materialism, leads to things like greed. All of the human vices are then amplified because you have to look out for yourself. You're not connected with other people. It doesn't matter if somebody's starving on the other side of the world. That's the view of reality that we end up with. We're becoming better and better at creating distractions, which is an escape. And there's nothing wrong with an escape. I mean, sometimes the world is such that you want to escape it. It's not clear, though, that it's telling us something which is what we really want to know, which is what is actually going on here.
It's alarming, it's tragic, and it should fire up anybody who heeds what I say to take this work seriously, dead seriously. This raising of consciousness truly is salvation, you see. It saves us from this pit of darkness or ignorance, which is called the world. Infinite love, infinite fulfillment is what you might call our real home. This is where we come from. Somehow we left it, we lost paradise, and we've fallen into this world. The human condition, lost in thought, is really a state of darkness or ignorance. The wisdom of man is foolishness to God. Human knowledge is ignorance. Wisdom or faith is at a higher level when you begin to function from here rather than from here. And if you long sufficiently for truth, for whatever it is, love or peace or fulfillment in true knowledge, you will gradually find like a sort of compass within yourself that is being led in this direction. And then freedom, you could say, takes you by the hand and leads you along the way. Yes, it takes a bit of getting used to if you're not used to it. And fear is one of the things we have to overcome. But it much depends on how determined you are, how much you want to be free.
One of the problems with society and the way that we live right now is that we are conditioned to operate from a place of fear. For example, the news media fills us with fear. Even our financial system is driven by fear of not having enough money. But in actuality, the fear itself is what causes the problem. It cuts us off from our connection to our spirit or our higher self or source. It cuts us off from our intuition. And so my work has been, for myself, is to always maintain that connection and to not buy into the messages that this paradigm is constantly feeding us. Don't buy into those messages. And when people say to me that, oh, what you're saying is wonderful, but it's not practical for this life, we have to be in survival mode. My answer is, for me, I used to be in survival mode and it gave me cancer. So I refuse to go into that mode anymore.
I have been depressed about the state of the world, about the land misuse. But the real depression, which lasted several years, occurred when I was 47, after a great love experience, which really turned me upside down. I suppose you could say it altered the course of my life. I wandered for several years, not really knowing where to go or what to do. So I know a lot about depression and despair. Yes, the world is full of good advice, isn't it? I often think one of the most practical things is simply go out for a walk, open the window, see there are other people out there, some of them even worse than you are, in a worse state. And then one thing leads to another. Well, as they say, time heals. Sometimes you just got to stick it out, like the weather. Sometimes you just got to wait a bit. But mercifully, things come to pass, both the good and the bad. For most of us, sometime in life, the clouds do pass.
A lot of people ask me, is it just about positive thinking? No, it's none of that. It's about being yourself. And when you are being yourself, sometimes you have a bad day. Don't suppress it. It really is about embracing every aspect of you, even the parts of you that are struggling, even the parts of you that don't feel good. It will pass. But the next step is to be optimistic about the future. To me, being optimistic is very different from being positive. Optimistic means I may not feel this way now, but it doesn't mean it's always going to be that way. Tomorrow's going to be different. You are a facet of the divine or God or source. So if all you do is to allow spirit and know and trust that my spirit came here for a purpose and a reason, and you allow it to express itself through you, what is truly yours comes to you.
That is such an important concept. And I realized when I came back from my coma journey that the vast majority of problems in our world are not because I don't love my neighbor enough, not because I don't love my enemy enough, but I don't love myself enough.
The wonderful story about this new science is that programming is what creates our life, and parents are programmers. And so if parents knew that their words that they say to a child are shaping the future of that child, then parents would start to say different things to their children. Instead of criticizing them, saying, that's not good enough, and you don't deserve this, and who do you think you are? Trying to get them to do better. But remember, a child under 7 is not thinking. It's just recording. What does it hear? Not good enough, not worthy, not lovable, not deserving. It's more effective for parents to say, you are the most wonderful child, you are smart, you can do anything, you're very powerful, you're a creator. Why? Because if those are the programs, and then the child's life is 95% from those programs, all of those programs give power to a child. And so we have to recognize, I want to be a conscious parent, so that if both parents are doing this, at some point, they will rewrite the negative programming and then become truly conscious parents and creating the next generation with power.
This is a lesson that's very crucial for this world to learn today, especially in the face of ongoing violence, warfare, conflict, refugees. Humanity at our current level of progression is in a very kind of barbaric phase of our growth. And it is time for us to wake up and realize we have responsibility. In fact, I would say that our materialist science, by giving us this lead of thinking we're all separate, and then Darwinian evolution, which was misinterpreted in the 20th century as survival of the fittest in competition, only the strongest survive. That's not the way evolution really works. In fact, modern biologists will point to the amount of collaboration and cooperation in the biological world. That's how biological success happens. And we see exactly the opposite with what humans are doing in wrecking our planet, even as we speak. And this kind of greedy selfishness and the polarization of wealth with the rich. I just saw today that the 400 wealthiest families in the United States have more wealth than the bottom 60% of the population. That's wrong. Completely wrong. And we see that all around the world.
Becoming rich comes with a number of perks. The appeal of getting more money means that your life becomes a lot more comfortable. And yeah, I know plenty of very wealthy people who are very, very unhappy because they learn, among other things, that while you can get some creature comforts and your life can be easier in many ways, it does not address the question of who and what we are. And also is not going to address the question of you're going to die. And what do you think about that?
My wife, my family, my home, my job, my work, my possessions, my money. What can we take with us beyond the grave? That's really a good question. What can I take with me beyond the grave? Everything else we leave behind. I can tell you, when you reach my age, it's only too obvious. Clouds come and go. The seasons come and go. Everything in this world comes to pass. That's the nature of this world. But this stillness is eternal. It doesn't change, does it? It's here, it's in France, it's in Australia. Same stillness, unchanging, always now. It's absolutely crucial to be present. If you ask someone, when were you happy? Almost everybody will give you an answer, often years and years ago, often when they were children. Then suddenly, without knowing why, they were just happy. And if you ask them to describe it, they'll usually give you an answer which describes being present. Just seeing the sunshine, or just by the seaside, just seeing the waves, or just stroking a dog, just suddenly feeling the touch of the dogs, or the look in the dog's eyes. These are moments of insight, and amazingly people remember them all their lives, because those are the real moments when we've actually touched on what's real in life.
It doesn't mean that all the problems suddenly go away. Life is always offering stresses and struggles. But no matter what, in the end, everything's going to be okay. And if it's not okay right now, that means it's not the end yet. Even death is not final. Even death is something that's not to be feared.
But at the end of the day, it's the actions we take in this world that are part of our growth or lack of growth in those spiritual realms. Because if all people knew is, oh, that's a beautiful afterlife, this is such a crummy little existence for me, I'm just going over there. Wrong move, because you never dodge the issues that you face in this life through suicide or through leaving this world. And so it's very important to realize there is no way out but through. And the more we bring that love into this world, the more we actually grow as souls. And that's why this whole universe exists, is for sentient beings to make these discoveries, to learn and teach together in growing towards their understanding of their connection with the universe.
Interesting, as a scientist, I never believed in spirituality because I was programmed with a belief of genes controlling life. But as my world changed and I started to see how the environment was controlling the cells, I started to recognize something, that no two people are exactly the same. And the identity is a set of protein receptors, antennas, just like television antennas, on the surface of the cell. I say, well, why is it important? Because these are called self receptors, receivers of self. Then where's the signal of self coming from that activates these antennas? The answer is not inside the cell, outside the cell. And that's when I thought, oh my goodness, my identity is picked up by these antennas, but the antennas are receiving a broadcast from the environment. This is the television, and I am the broadcast. Because if I am the broadcast is always here. It's the televisions that come and go. So then we have to recognize the idea of death is not what we have believed it to be, an end. Death just means, okay, the television's broken, but you're still the broadcast. You're still here in a different form. And you can manifest the physical part again. That's called reincarnation. But you're always here as a spirit. And once we own that we are spiritual entities, then we become empowered because the fear of death will disappear. Field, invisible moving forces that influence the physical world. I go, okay, cool. I go, wait. There's another word with the same definition. Spirit, invisible moving forces that influence the physical world. Whether you say the word field or whether you say the word spirit, they are functionally the same thing. And so this is a uniting of ancient spirituality and modern science are coming across to become one again the same.
I love that quote from Nikola Tesla. When science first begins to investigate non-physical phenomena, they will discover more in the first decade than they have in all the existence of the scientific revolution. And I think that we're getting very close to entering that decade even now. This world is on the verge of a tremendous revolution in thinking that is long overdue.
I think that we desperately need a kind of sense of spiritual reconnection in the Western world. There's been an extreme process of secularization, of abandonment of traditional religion in favor of a secular scientific worldview. But that turns out to be very thin and unsustaining and gives such a narrow view of human nature and consciousness, and also leads to consequences that are so destructive to the environment and our relationship to the environment. Previously, before Descartes, in the Middle Ages in Europe, the worldview was that nature is alive, the earth is alive, animals and plants are truly alive, they're beings with souls. The whole universe is alive, the stars are intelligent. So what we need is a reconnection with that sense of spirit and greater connection with the whole earth, the whole cosmos, and the realm of consciousness beyond the human level. And that's where I think spiritual practices are so important, because this is something that for most people is only meaningful through direct experience. Meditation, connecting with nature, relating to plants, pilgrimage, taking part in festivals and holy days, rituals, singing and chanting, fasting, even sports, which for many people is the most common way in which in the modern world people achieve an altered state of consciousness.
The big question obviously is, who am I? The one thing that seems constant within me is my awareness of everything happening around me. That consciousness, that beautiful miracle, is within everyone and everything. It's a powerful concept that highest creativity within the universe dwells within us. And if we can actually experience that, it's like our heart just opens up in this incredible feeling of bliss and joy and wonder.
When you do that, what mystics often talk about is that the world is completely perfect. The world out there, everything is working exactly the way it's supposed to. So this is nice if you're in an ashram and everything is pretty and quiet. It's not so nice if you're in the middle of a war zone somewhere, because into thinking that the world is exactly the way it's supposed to be in the midst of chaos, that doesn't sound right. And nevertheless, this is one of the more common things that mystics talk about, that their view of the world is everything is interconnected, it's related to consciousness in some way, and it's perfect.
In my journey, I saw very clearly not just the afterlife, but I saw oneness with that divine, becoming one with. That was never a concept that I would have entertained based on my religious beliefs. And that's a lesson that unfortunately our religious systems have in some cases lost sight of. A universal spirit that is part of us, that we have purpose and meaning in our lives, but that we're all united at a very deep level, and that you should do unto others as you would have done unto yourself.
If you think of those disco balls, you know, those balls with all those mirrors all around the ball, they project a light onto the wall. When you look at the walls in a room that has the mirror balls, it's got all these speckles of light on the walls. Imagine if each of those speckles on the wall was one human being, one physical person. So if you imagine that each of these speckles of light believe that they are a separate being from the other speckles of light, we start competing with them and fighting with them. The whole is fighting with itself. And one day when we die, we realize, oh my gosh, we were actually all from the same source. We were all actually one.
The other way of saying it is that we are here because we are the universe that is looking back on itself, right? So from just a mainstream scientific perspective, the universe is here for some reason, and we are the universe, the portion of the universe that is aware. That's what we are, is the universe being self-aware.
It's said that we have a soul, which is, of course, that divine spark, that part, that light that lights every man. Then there is hope for us. There's more to life than meets the eye. We can't capture it within our thinking mind and describe it. So it's said that real knowledge is not something we learn by description. It comes from revelation. My ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts.
You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You will be taken care of.